Whether this is your first or 100th webinar, please take a moment to review these helpful reminders. We will begin shortly. Again, welcome to our inaugural No Footprint event, Confronting Crisis 2050, a panel discussion inspired by the recent film, ENDGAME 2050, about the current ecological and existential crises facing the planet, predictions of what the world will be like by 2050, and the role humans can play in slowing the environmental breakdown. To lead us through today's panel, please welcome PMC President and Founder, Bill Ryerson. Take it away, Bill.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to PMC's first No Footprint event. We're holding this online seminar to focus on environmental sustainability issues, including the rights of women and girls, the rights of other species, and population dynamics, all without contributing to the human footprint. With what's going on the planet, it's very exciting to have the broader PMC community come together for this seminar, and we have about 300 people participating. We thank you for being here. We encourage you to interact with us and with each other through the chat box. And if you have questions either about the film or about any of the issues we are discussing, put them in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can during the time we're together. For those who haven't had a chance to view the film ENDGAME 2050, here's a short trailer that will bring us all up to speed as to what the issues are that are being addressed.
In the past, there have been 5 episodes of mass extinctions in which the majority of the plants and animals of the planet were wiped out.
Right now, we're undergoing what's called a mass extinction, and that means that the rates of extinction are much higher.
I'm sure many people think, what has biodiversity ever done for me, and why should I worry about it? If you don't have a functioning ecological system, people will not survive.
Fishless oceans were actually predicted at least 40 years ago.
Rationing food and water doesn't get you down too. And I can't remember the last time we could eat 3 meals, just like normal.
And what's this I hear about fish? The staff say you're asking for fish at every meal? You know we don't have any, and you don't have any at home either.
I want us to stop treating this planet like a garbage dump. And I want us to stop pretending that there is some like plan B. We are destroying the only home that we know of in the universe that will support life.
We're the only species we know of that is determinedly set out to destroy itself.
I'm very happy to introduce our panel. They include Dr. Sofia Pineda Ochoa, who has many areas of expertise, including being a physician, environmentalist, and maker of the film ENDGAME 2050. Dr. Paul Ehrlich is a professor of biology at Stanford University and author of The Population Bomb and many other books on population issues. Itang Young is a member of the PMC board and is a faith-based environmental activist an assistant minister at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York City, and Yael Wolinsky-Nahmias is professor of environmental and political science at the University of Southern California. I thank all of the panelists for joining us today. Today's panel is powered by Population Media Center and made possible because of the support of donors, some of whom I see here on today's webinar. Thank you, donors, and thank you to our production team at PMC. Okay, let's get into the discussion. The topic of this panel, as you realize, was inspired by Sofia's film ENDGAME 2050, which depicted the environmental and existential crises we're facing on the planet today. Sofia, when I watched the film, it seemed to me as if it was a guide on how to live a green and healthy life. Was there a defining moment that made you turn from physician to environmental filmmaker?
I think it was more of a progressive situation rather than one simple event that transformed my mindset. And for full disclosure, I still work part-time as a physician, but you're right, my focus has shifted, has shifted towards the environment. I think it was progressively learning more and more about the terrible situation that we find, the severity of it, and just understanding that, I mean, that's objectively very, very important. Like, I can't think of anything more important than that.
So it was an accumulation of evidence of the crisis that we're facing.
Yes, I think so. And also a realization that really there's no human health without planetary health. So no matter what your medical specialty is, you know, if there's no planetary health, you know, it's
I often say that sustainability is the most important public health issue. What do you think sets your film apart from other environmental films?
Well, in making the film, and the reason why I made it is because sometimes I feel like some of the environmental documentaries, like they sugarcoat the message. I tried to make it a film. That's what I tried. I don't know if I accomplished that or not, but I tried to clearly lay out the severity of the situation in which we find ourselves in, and to not sugarcoat it. Like sometimes I'll see a film about water depletion, and at the end they'll say something like, well, we need to respect water. And I'm like, well, you know, we find ourselves in a really difficult situation. We need to be clear, and it doesn't serve the environment or anyone to sugarcoat and to kind of like tone down the situation just to try to not make people uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I was trying to do. And yeah, that's what was my intent.
We hear in the news this week that one of the biggest glaciers in Antarctica is facing possible collapse, and it could raise sea level by 10 feet. Of the issues you addressed in the film, you discussed climate change near the end of the film. Why didn't you address it sooner?
Well, I think that it was just simple. Strategically, my goal was also to get people to watch the film, you know, from start to the end of it. And as such an important issue that climate change is, unfortunately, I think that, and this is very unfortunate, but it's kind of polarizing. Like, there's so much misinformation about that and so much denialism about the science on that, which is pretty clear there shouldn't be, but unfortunately there is. So that's why I made the kind of like in my mind, the strategic decision to not start with it. But I did start with another topic that I think is also very, very important, which is the extinction of species, the sixth mass extinction. And, you know, we see reports today, you know, in the film I mentioned that in 40 years, 50% of wildlife had disappeared. And actually, since the film was released, I wish I could update it because the WWF released a more recent report. I'm sure you're very familiar with it. They said that in the last 50 years, 68% of wildlife has been decimated. And so, I mean, I think this is a crime like no other. And that's why I put it in the beginning. And also, like I said, because I want people to watch the film, I feel like Extinction is a subject that kind of causes some kind of like morbid curiosity, which is,
Yes.
So that's why I put it in the beginning. But nothing against climate change.
Well, clearly biodiversity is what makes the planet habitable. So it's a very important topic, but many people don't realize this. In the film, you also talk extensively about the rights of women and girls. Could you comment on how the rights of women and girls is an environmental issue?
Absolutely. Yes, I commented on the human rights, on the rights of women and girls in the section of population growth, because, well, the simple answer to your question, Bill, is because right now we're growing our population by 80 million people per year. That's net growth. And that's something that's grossly unsustainable by any measure and on any front. And so if you look at anything from our plastic waste to the deforestation caused by palm oil to everything, we're kind of losing every single war right now. It's very unfortunate, but and part of the reason for that is because we're growing our footprint, we're growing our population in this way that's simply unsustainable. And the rights of girls to be unmarried, the rights of girls to not have to go child marriages, the rights of women to stay in school, to have an education, to have healthcare, is one very important, crucial thing that we can do to help stabilize our population growth. So that's why I mentioned it in that section.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Sophia. My next question is for Paul Ehrlich. Paul, starting at least in 1968 and maybe earlier, you were writing about the possibility of ecological collapse. And you've written a lot about it over the decades since then. This probably makes you less surprised by what we're witnessing today in the way of a pandemic, wildfires, and hurricanes than the average member of the public. Why do you think so many people have ignored your warnings over so many years?
I think, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is basically evolutionarily. We've been on the planet as upright hominids for maybe 1 million years, depending on how you count it. But for almost all that time, the critical thing was for us to be able to dodge sudden things like a leopard leaping at us. If somebody throws a rock at your head, you don't have to think about what to do. You can do a set of differential equations in your brain very rapidly and duck. And to make the leopard or the rock stand out, we have also learned to keep the background quiet, still. You can try this anytime with your cell phone. Try moving your head and watching a scene, and you'll see the scene stand still. If you take the cell phone and do the video that way, and then look at the video, you'll throw up. Because when you do that with the video, you don't have the receptors that tell you it's moving, and that makes a big difference. What's the big reason now that we haven't done better? Because what we need to now learn to pay attention to is the changes in the background that we psychologically tend to hold still. That's one reason. Another reason is for the last a few hundred years at least, we have made finance the center of our culture. And there isn't any way for most people to see how the changes in the background are hitting them financially, or to see how they're going to be able to get financially better off with the changes in the background. So we're fighting, we need a gigantic cultural change, and at the moment the culture is changing in exactly the wrong direction. As I told my group at the National Academy of Sciences, There's nothing that any scholar should be doing today that isn't dealing with an immediate problem, except trying to get a regime change in the United States. Because if we don't get that in November, I hate to say what's going to happen.
Speaking of that, at least some of the presidential debates have included the issue of climate change, and many people see that as the only environmental issue. For those who are new to the topic, why does population growth impact the environment, and how is it an environmental issue?
Well, I can give you just one easy example. There was a study done recently that shows that having one less child in your family is the equivalent in terms of climate disruption of stopping driving 23 times. In other words, if you have one child more than you did before, you are the equivalent of turning 23 new drivers loose. Huge impact from population growth, but of course, it's only one of the relatively serious problems. If you look at what's happening to sperm counts and reproduction, you may find that actually we have a solution in hand, which isn't the solution we want. The most recent data, which are not yet published, suggests that we may have a sperm count globally of 0 around 2050. We'll go back to the days when women used to say, you know, a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle.
We first met right after you published The Population Bomb, and you came to speak at Yale University where I was doing my graduate work. And I'm one of many people who was inspired by your work to dedicate my career, or at least some of my time, to population issues. But there was also a whole group of people who reacted in the opposite way and were really afraid to touch the sensitive issues related to population. In the film, you use the term Homo moronicus. Could you elaborate on that term?
Well, after all, Linnaeus named us Homo sapiens, the wise man. But all you have to do is turn on a TV today, particularly if you go to Fox News, and you'll see that we're not wise men. We are not paying attention to the critical issues that which are covered in the film, which are actually going to make the lives of our children, grandchildren. I have great-grandchildren now that are going to be lucky to be able to live any kind of life at all. We are, as has already been pointed out, wrecking our life support systems. We are part of biodiversity. The discussion of biodiversity is still, I wouldn't say it, moronic would be good. But I mean, at Stanford University, maybe the best university in the world, they're arguing now about having a new school of sustainability and climate, as if climate were the only problem. Yeah. They might do better to have one on sustainability and nuclear weapons, because if people don't realize it, but the danger of human extinction or extinction of our civilization is just as big from the nuclear weapons, maybe bigger, than from climate change or the toxification, the spreading of the chemicals that are making us unable to reproduce as much as we'd like to.
Yeah, I know you've written a lot about toxification of the environment. Just thinking about students who might be going through a school focused on sustainability issues, are the actions that are needed by the public and by activists different now than they were 40 years ago?
They're a lot more desperate now, because as you can see from what's happening, most of my colleagues now feel that we are in the beginning of the collapse of civilization. So we don't have, after all, when the population bomb was written, that was more than half a century ago. You must be now 52 years old at least.
At least.
Oh, yeah, right. And we don't have the time anymore. That's one of the reasons that I love the way the young people are coming out. I love the way people are talking about equity. I should say the young people talking about equity in our racist society, where we waste the talents of huge numbers of people because in our society they're not considered to be useful citizens when they actually are often brilliant. So we have huge things to do and we have very little time to do it. And we really need essentially a revolution.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for your participation tonight and for the inspiration you've given me and many other people. And I'm hoping some of our viewers will be inspired by you to take up the cause. I'd like to switch gears now and turn to Itang to gain a faith-based perspective on sustainability. Itang, why is it important that faith-based communities and leaders get involved in the sustainability conversation?
First off, Bill, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to sit on the panel this evening. And I want to extend a gracious thank you for all of the other esteemed panelists who share the virtual dais with me on this evening. With regard to your question about the importance of faith-based communities and leaders getting involved in sustainability conversations, Bill, the answer is simple. Our sacred texts give us a moral obligation to be involved in all things related to sustainability and climate change, from Christianity to Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, to the teachings and the wisdoms of indigenous religions and other world religions. Through our sacred texts, our practices and rituals, we are reminded of a moral obligation to care for our communities. And sustainable lifestyles are a way for people of faith to embody our deepest values and practice exactly what it is we preach. And at scale, sustainable behavioral change is a vital part of the solution to the environmental and the climate change crisis. So if one's religious experience and beliefs is strongly connected to the precepts that are ascribed to in the sacred text, insofar as the sanctity of God's creation, we'll feel compelled to defend the natural world from destruction that results from climate change, mass consumerism, capitalism, and the literal destruction of the earth. And so whatever our faith journeys are, whatever our motivations are, we meaning people of faith, leaders of faith, are challenged to provide sanctuary and guidance to the world as we go through this existential crisis. So from the worldview of faith and theology, we're called to make a transition to sustainable living, both socially, politically, economically, which moves us to a place where we can adopt responsible development and respectable sustainability principles. And as you know, this change will require a shift of the social paradigm, a shift of the mental paradigm, but most importantly, a shift of the spiritual paradigm. And religion, faith, spirituality is actually an essential and a powerful component of that solution. So through our faith leadership, we can reclaim earth-honoring values and practices that involve living simply, treading more lightly, and being mindful of our impact on the earth and its inhabitants.
In other words, preserving God's creation.
Correct.
Yeah. In the film, there's a statement made that other species have the right to exist in their own right and not as natural resources for human consumption. What do you think about that?
I actually think it's a valid point that was made when we look at the sacred texts of Christianity. We're told that, God made man, God made woman, God made all of the animals. And in God making a life, God ensured that every one of God's creation, inclusive language is very important, that every one of God's creation had its place. And when we think about humans and different species and our relationship to one another, I immediately think of the food chain. They're like, well, if we're supposed to, respect the animals, how are we going to eat, and et cetera, et cetera. And while that is a very valid point as well, we can't ignore our mandate to respect all of God's creation. whether it's a human creation or an underwater species creation. One more thing that the phrase made me think about is not only the species that are not necessarily human, but also the human species itself. As when we look at the existential climate change crisis here in our own nation, we see that even some of God's most precious creations, i.e. Black and Brown people in under-resourced, underserved communities across the nation aren't given the space and respect and the environmental equity that they deserve. So valid point that leads to a multi-layered and very complex conversation.
Indeed, you've really pointed out that social justice is and has to be part of the sustainability conversation. And speaking of social justice, this week in the news, there's a report by a whistleblower of hysterectomies being performed on women in ICE detention centers without the consent of the women. Is there ever any place for coercion in reproductive matters?
So, Bill, I must say that the news this week of the unneeded hysterectomies were quite alarming, but not surprising, given the history of violence against Black female bodies in our country, and not only our country, but around the world. I mean, given the narrative of Sarah Bartman, the woman from South Africa who was pillaged from her home by Hendrik Caesar and Alexander Dunlap. She was paraded around the world and her body was used for experiments in the 19th century. To J. Marion Sims, who, while hailed as the father of modern gynecology, did medical experiments on enslaved Black women without anesthesia, to the more recent history of forcible sterilizations right here in America, particularly by the North Carolina Eugenics Board. So the news is not really surprising at all. But is there a space for forcible sterilization? Absolutely not. I mean, the practice is inhumane, to say the least, and it's guided by the philosophy of social Darwinism, and it conveys a message that, we should produce less in order to preserve more. But in the producing of the less, it was those whom society considered to be undesirable, i.e. Black women, the poor, immigrants, in this case, refugees, who were affected the most. So for those facilitating these forcible sterilizations, that was their way of breeding out the numbers for future populations. And essentially, the practice was a solution to overpopulation and poverty, which is essentially rooted in medical racism and medical genocide. But from my perspective, forcible sterilization should never be used as a solution to solve the world's ills. So instead of forcible solutions, perhaps we as a society need to be forcibly provide access to equitable education for women and girls. We should forcibly push our governments to advocate for empowering women to decide what is and is not right for their own bodies, and creating opportunities where we can all live into the fullness of who we are, while simultaneously exercising our own agency.
Thank you so much, Itang. Your Population Media Center fully agrees that all of our work must be done within a human rights context. Now I'd like to focus on future generations by bringing in Professor Nahmias of USC. Yael, it's PMC's belief that youth hold great power in changing the future. And as I mentioned earlier, I got involved in this issue as an activist while I was a graduate student, and I was as outraged then about the environmental situation as Greta Thunberg and her followers are today. Yet it feels like 50 years later, we're still fighting the same fight. Is there a difference in the environmental field now than there was half a century ago?
I agree with you, Bill, that today's youth may be and should be just as outraged and maybe even more outraged. And I think we do see some changes, and we are seeing more outrage among young people. We've seen millions of young people participate in the climate strike, and the Sunrise Movement in this country has been gaining some political momentum. But there are also some important differences that I'd like to note. I think the environmental movement today has much more detailed scientific knowledge about the consequences of no action. And this has been very clearly described, in the film. The consequences for humans, the consequences for biological systems, consequences for other species, the consequences for the planet. And in addition to that, we also have very clear evidence about the urgency of meaningful action. And that urgency is both because of the huge consequences, but also because the pace of climate change has been much faster than originally predicted. There are some other important differences. I think that today's environmental movement is more attuned and more concerned about environmental justice, as we just discussed, as Itang just described. That is an important development, both because of the moral nature of these issues that we're talking about, and also because it will increase the legitimacy of the movement overall. And perhaps two other points in terms of differences. I think that the ability of young people today to communicate with millions of other people over social media makes the environmental movement much more intrinsically international. Mm-hmm. And that is really important because all of the issues that we're talking about really are global problems. And lastly, I think that youth today, I hope, I believe, especially after the last few years, is recognizing the need to become more politically involved in order to address environmental issues. And there are more than 25 million young voters in this country between the ages of 18 and 25. So they can make quite a big difference in politics.
I know in my conversations with young people at high schools and universities when I've given talks, what I've realized is one of the differences is when I got involved, the potential for collapse was a long way in the future, whereas all the young people that are getting involved in this issue now see this as something that's going to impact their lifetimes and in the very near future.
Right, there is an element of almost self-interest in that. Yes. It's obviously a moral issue, but there is also a matter of this can happen very soon.
You have two different disciplines in your title, environmental studies and political science. How do you link these disciplines together to motivate students to become engaged?
Well, I really think that environmental protection in general and climate change more specifically are really inherently political issues because they involve interests, very different interests within our society. Mm-hmm. And climate change in particular has become such a politically controversial issue in this country, in great contradiction to other Western countries. I do find that students are interested both in understanding the science of climate change and environmental problems, but also the political reality and the opportunities for political and social action. And there are many opportunities for them to get involved in international organizations, in local groups, using social media to reach out, to engage with others. And the truth is that both local communities, but also society at large, we really need that energy. We really need the creativity and the innovation of young people. And it's not just the scientific innovation, it's the innovation in human action, in participation, in making this part of your own life. Mm-hmm. And I think that overall young people in general are more aware and more concerned about environmental issues than older generations. And so that, you know, makes me more hopeful. And I think that what I try to convey to them is that really there are very few things in this world that are better both for your soul and for society than value-based participation.
Yeah, I can attest to that. My whole career has been focused on issues of great importance to global sustainability, and it's very rewarding. And I know a couple of your students are doing internships with Population Media Center. So for those in our audience, there are lots of opportunities to become a volunteer or to become engaged as a professional in this field. And it is an extremely rewarding work. You know, one of the things that's surprising to many of us in the environmental field is that a lot of people, including some people in high office, view climate change as a hoax. And when you look at the comment section on the YouTube site for ENDGAME 2050, there are many comments of outrage that the film considered climate change an environmental issue and worthy of inclusion in the film. Do you have advice on what we can do to get people to listen to and take seriously science with regard to environmental topics?
Yeah, I really think that it is both tragic and dangerous that the American people in 2020 continue to be exposed to skepticism about climate change in particular and about environmental protection more generally. It is, though, important to note that majorities of Americans feel that they have fair or moderate knowledge about these issues. And also a majority, about 60% of Americans, believe that global climate change is a major threat to the country. And this is actually a recent poll that was taken during the pandemic. This has changed significantly from 10 years ago. So the rate of people who've been stating that has increased by about 25%. However, most of the increase is among Democrats. And so about 88% of Democrats and independent-leaning Democrats do consider climate change a major threat to the nation, but only 30% of Republicans do as well. One other thing to note, though, is that young Republicans, however, differ significantly from baby boomers and older Republicans on this issue. They're much more concerned. They believe in the science, and they think that the government really does have the obligation to do much more on these issues.
So is it just a matter of age, or is there something else about that 30% of Republicans who are concerned about climate issues?
I think a good portion of it is age. I think it is really kind of shocking again, though, that partisanship is a stronger factor in people's beliefs about climate change than their knowledge. And so really the belonging being identified as Republican or Democrat makes a huge difference. But I think the one thing that we really need to be all thinking about is how to keep leaders accountable. What they do and what they do not do can make a difference and will make a difference for many generations to come. So I am somewhat hopeful because I think that we still have a window of time to act, and that there is a path that can lead to a safer world. And it involves, some of the individual actions that were portrayed and discussed in the film, and it involves a significant change in society, as Paul mentioned, and it also involves, significant policy change.
There's a parallel here with the use of tobacco products. I know for much of the last half century, the tobacco industry tried to cast doubt on the science because they were going to lose money, they thought, if people stopped smoking. And I think what is driving a lot of the intentional disinformation on climate is the same kind of financial motivation. People are concerned about stocks that they hold or companies that they run losing value if we give up on such things as fossil fuels. Is there a way to point out the financial self-interest and self-dealing that's going on here as a way to help Republicans in particular overcome their skepticism?
Well, a few points maybe. I think one thing to remember is that society in this country, our society is more attuned to short-term interest than to long-term interest. And that is very unfortunate in the context of the issues that we're talking about. And the focus on the kind of immediate gratification and financial interest. There have been significant interest changes in, among business leaders, however. And so, some of the biggest opponents and who've been involved in lobbying and preventing comprehensive federal policy are somewhat more acceptable, and partly because I think they see the future, and the future is not in fossil fuels. And so that is a very strong force that I think will help change Republicans' attitudes, but also leadership attitudes.
Yael, thank you so much. I'd like to circle all the way back to Sofia. Sofia, you started this conversation really with your wonderful film. And for those in our audience who haven't watched it, I urge you to do so. What has been the reaction to the film, and how many people have viewed it to date?
Well, the film is in several platforms, but the main ones is YouTube and Amazon Prime. And I think YouTube, last I checked, is around 500,000. And Amazon Prime, I'm not able to see the metrics, but we've gotten a good amount of, I think we're close to 80 reviews, which for a documentary is, because most people don't review it on Amazon. So it's more than I expected. Of course, I want it to be widely available. That's why I made it available for free on YouTube. And the reaction, well, it's some of the things that Dr. Yael had mentioned. One of the things that I was surprised to see is a lot of conspiracy theory, like concerns, like a lot of that, a lot of science denialism, which was totally a surprise for me. Like these new world order situations about the elite trying to control, like this kind of denying that there's any kind of environmental issues, and if you bring it up, it's in order to control. But anyway, even though those are like what rattle me the most, I think that people who accept science, the thing that like surprised them the most was, or what interested them The most was the part about population. A lot of people told me like, wow, like I thought that was really interesting. Like I didn't realize that we're growing so fast, and that was really rewarding. And we did have a lot of people reach out to us from all over the world, like from Saudi Arabia, from Vietnam, from Singapore, to offer to translate the film to their language. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that's like the biggest honor that I could have.
That's wonderful.
I know. So to make it, available in a lot of other languages. And so, and a lot of people say the film is like raw. And I'm thinking to myself, well, like I spend so much time polishing the script. Like, I don't think it's raw, but I've been pleased with the reaction, and I hope I'm gonna keep promoting it, and I hope I can get even a lot more people to watch this free film.
Well, congratulations again to you for a wonderful job and stimulating a lot of very important discussion in our society, not to mention Saudi Arabia and the other countries where this film has been viewed. It's a very important film, and I congratulate you. And I want to thank all of our panelists for their participation tonight. Sofia, as you mentioned, a lot of people have various theories, and in the population field, they run rampant. Many people have no idea that at the dinner table tonight, there will be 225,000 additional people than there were last night. And tomorrow, another 225,000 additional people. And those who do know that the population is growing so fast think that, in fact, it may not matter environmentally because the carbon footprint of people in many fast-growing countries is so small on a per capita basis. But in fact, the total footprint of adding 2.5 billion people between now and 2050 is roughly the climate equivalent of adding 2 United States to the planet. Another thing I've discovered in my work in the population field is many people don't understand why the many non-users of contraception, adult non-users, and that is about 43% of the adult population, do not use methods of contraception. They don't understand why. And they make the assumption it must be because of lack of access. Whereas the demographic and health surveys show that, in fact, the top reasons given for non-use of contraception include misinformation about safety or effectiveness, male opposition, religious opposition, or fatalism, the belief that they don't have control over how many children they're going to have, that their deity or somebody else has made that decision since the beginning of the universe. So trying to give people self-efficacy and help them understand the safety and effectiveness of contraception is a key part of addressing population issues, as is, as you pointed out, addressing the rights of women and girls. And on this subject, for people who are in our audience who don't know about Population Media Center's work, what we do is create long-running entertainment serialized dramas and other entertainment formats on radio and television that attract huge audiences and that watch as key characters in the local language in various countries around the world gradually evolve into role models for the audience on such issues as avoiding teenage pregnancy, stopping violence against women, promoting daughter education, stopping child marriage, use of family planning, pursuing small family norms, and adopting environmentally friendly behaviors. So this is part of the strategy that I think is often misunderstood, that to achieve sustainability, it's not just policymakers in the capitals around the world who have to take action. All of us as citizens of the world and of each country need to be active to help bring about a sustainable planet. And I think that brings us to a conclusion of our discussion for the evening. Again, I want to thank Sofia and all of our panelists and our participants. We appreciate your joining us so much. Thanks so much to our partners and donors who made this seminar possible. And thanks to the PMC staff who have been working very hard to put together exciting and informative programs to engage our followers. And tonight, thanks to our behind the scenes production team. If you are a member of the Giving Circles program of PMC, we will see you at the VIP meet and greet in a few minutes. Be sure to check the email that Bria Holness, our donor engagement officer, sent you, because it has a separate link to the meet and greet. It's not on this link for this seminar, and we'll see you there shortly. And if you found this seminar informative and would like to stay in touch, please follow Population Media Center's work on social media and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do all of this by going to populationmedia.org. And the website will be up on the screen for a bit of time after a 1-minute video about PMC's work that we're going to show you now. So again, thanks to everyone. Good night, and please enjoy the brief video.
For thousands of years, stories have inspired us, taught us, and guided our life choices. A powerful story can change our lives and have a domino effect on our communities, countries, and the world. What will your story be? Together, we can build a sustainable planet with equal rights for all. Help us write the next chapter. Become part of our story.